to you all today alongside our other speaker, Stephen. As Sophia mentioned, I'm Actuarial Director at the Government Actuaries Department, and that does mean that I am a civil servant. So there are areas that I might be limited in what I can say throughout this session. So hopefully you'll forgive me if I don't delve too much into some of the details on some of the questions that might arise, but I'm sure we can explore some really interesting issues. Can we just go to the next slide, please? What I'm going to do is try and set the scene a little bit with some background information, which is going to touch on these three key questions that we're going to look at throughout the webinar. So I'll really be providing some of the data and the thoughts behind that, and then hopefully we'll start exploring what some of the implications of that might be. So next slide, please. So starting by looking at some of the data. The ONS regularly prepares projections of the UK population, and the last set of projections are the 2020 based projections, which were released earlier this year. And to do that, the ONS uses census data, surveys, other data streams, and a variety of expert input, including some from GAD. And they use that to construct future birth, death, and migration rates, which all get compiled into these projections of what the future population structure might look like. Now on this slide, I've put together some information from those latest projections, and you can see on the left that despite a slowing of improvements in mortality rates in recent years, the 2020 projections still do anticipate increasing life expectancy into the future. And just to note, these projections do make some allowance for the impact of COVID in the short term, but then start to revert to some longer term trends thereafter. On the right hand side, we can see the impact of some of these migration rates and the deaths and births on the progression of the population structure over time. So the solid bars here show the 2020 population structure, and then the lines on the outside show the position in 2030. And you can see that we have increasing numbers of people over 65 into the retirement ages. And by 2030, that equates to around 19% of the population. In 2020, that was under 18%, and that increasing trend is expected to continue in the future. Part of that is driven by this increase in life expectancy. Part of it is also driven by some of the demographic features we can see in the chart. So if you look at the 2020 position, you can see around age 75, the peak in numbers there, which are post-World War II baby boom. And then around age 55, you can see the peak from the 1960s baby boom. And these features work their way through the projections and increase the numbers of people we see post-state pension age. So next slide, please. And what do these projections tell us about time in retirement? Well, on this slide here, I've taken some information from the projections about life expectancy and combined that with future state pension age ages, which are driven off the 2017 state pension age review, which set out an indication of when state pension age would increase. And what you can see here is over time, the period that people are expected to spend in retirement increases, despite the increase in state pension age. Now, the ratio between time in working age and time in retirement may also be altering slightly, but we have another state pension age review underway at the moment. We don't know what that's going to lead to. But what this does indicate is as people get to retirement, there's an expectation that they'll spend a longer period in retirement, which might mean they need more funds to have a comfortable retirement. The state pension provides a basic level of income, but most people will be looking to secure something slightly more comfortable than that. And policies such as auto-enrolment are intended to encourage that saving and help people secure that more comfortable retirement period. But if they need to secure a longer retirement period, then they're going to need to save more to do that. And whether or not the increase in working lifetime is sufficient will depend on the individual circumstances. Next slide, please. We also want to think about what are people actually doing. The ABR produce a cohort employment model for their economic forecasts. That's based on various historic data and some expert insights and opinions. The chart here shows expected participation rates in the labour market by age for the year 2020. What you can see here is from around the early 20s to around the age 60s, participation rates in the labour market are very high. Then we see quite a quick fall off, and then a particularly steep fall at around 65 to 66. But there remains a reasonable level of participation at some of the older ages as well. And a number of studies have recently highlighted increasing participation rates at older ages. The IFS produced some research on retirement and found that the increase in state pension age to 66 that occurred between 2018 and 2020 increased employment at age 65 by between 7 and 9 percentage points, so quite a noticeable increase. And that resulted in employment rates at age 65 in 2021, which were higher than at any time since the mid-1970s. There's also some analysis by Restless of 2019 data that ONS provided, which showed that the number of over 70s in employment had more than doubled in the decade since 2009. And that was the result of both increased participation rates at those ages, together with an increasing over 70s population. But the biggest factor was the increased participation rates. So next slide, please. So we're seeing both increasing numbers of older individuals in the population and increasing participation rates in the labour market at those older ages. But how does that translate to health in older ages? Now, the evidence here is less clear. There's less robustness about the data available, and it is available for shorter periods than for life expectancy. But on the side here, I've shown some information from ONS studies, and this shows healthy life expectancy at birth and at age 65. These figures are based on self-reporting of health and only cover the period 2014 to 2019. So it's difficult to imply too much from these, but you can see healthy life expectancy at birth appears to have reduced a bit in recent years, whereas healthy life expectancy from age 65, the reverse has happened and it's slightly increased in recent years. As I say, this is only covering a short period of time. It has limited data behind it, and it also predates COVID, which will have had an impact on short-term experience and may yet have implications on the longer term. Next slide, please. So all of the information I've presented so far is on a national basis, whereas there's significant heterogeneity across the country. And the charts here from a Lancet paper illustrate the diversity of life expectancy in different areas of the country. And we pulled out a specific example of the variation on the right-hand side, and you can see quite wide disparities between life expectancy in different areas of the country. Now, it's worth recognising that as smaller and smaller areas are considered, the statistical information becomes less robust, and the reasons for divergence can be difficult to identify. However, it does indicate that more deprived areas tend to have lower life expectancy, and lower healthy life expectancy than more affluent areas of the country. Now, the government recognises the importance of increasing healthy lifetimes and reducing those disparities between different areas and groups of the population. And the recently published Levelling Up white paper sets out a number of objectives to improve outcomes across the country. There are two objectives that are particularly relevant for this discussion. Firstly, to narrow the gap in healthy life expectancy between the most and least deprived areas by 2030. And secondly, by 2035, to increase healthy life expectancy at age 65 by 5 years. Now, achieving both of those objectives would be a fantastic success story and would raise quality of life across the country. And that in itself could potentially have quite wide-ranging impacts on working and retirement behaviours. Next slide, please. So I've set out some of the data that backs some of these thoughts, but there are a number of other factors that feed into decisions about working life and retirement. Excuse me. Our working options have become more flexible, and as Sophia said at the start, lots is changing in the world. Partial retirement and part-time working have become much more common, and that's allowed individuals to take a very different view of their work-life balance, giving them opportunities to take part in a wider range of activities whilst continuing to work, and also giving them more control over their finances and their ability to afford different ways of retiring or living their life. The population projections illustrate the ageing of the population, and that has implications for care needs across family groups. There's also ONS data that indicates younger people are living with their parents for longer than they have in the past. There's 50% of younger people are now not moving out of the family home until around 23 or 24. So housing plans and family structures are changing. And for any individual, it's a mixture of all of these factors that influence their behaviour and how long they continue to work. The question then is, which of these factors are going to see the biggest changes, and how will that reflect on behaviours in general? So next slide, please. So just to finish off, I wanted to briefly highlight why it is these are issues of relevance to GAD. Now, as well as supporting ONS develop their population projections, we support many departments and activities where the size, structure, and health of the population are relevant. We regularly review the financial health of the National Insurance Fund, which is heavily influenced by the scale of state pension payments, which are driven by the size of the population over state pension age. And the flip side of the benefit payments is the national insurance contributions, which are driven by the size of the working age population and participation in the labour market. The balance between those two parts of the population is a significant factor in the financial position of the National Insurance Fund. And you can see on the slide here how the 2020 population projections expect that balance to change, with the 2020 position showing almost 4 working age people to each pensioner, whereas this drops to 2.5 by 2060. We also have a role in the state pension age review, reporting to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, which covers longevity changes and the impact on expected time spent after state pension age. We work with DHSC, considering health and social care costs and demands. And we also play a significant role in the management of the public service pension schemes, which have memberships influenced by population changes. And there are many other areas of government activity where population demographics, health and life expectancy are significant factors in policy decisions. Hopefully that gives you a bit of insight of the scene that's behind all of this, why it's relevant to GAD. I'll stop there and pass back to Sophia.
Thank you, Matt. That was really interesting. Some really interesting points, and just fascinating to see that, you know, despite short-term changes to life expectancy, we're still going to see, you know, quite significant projections going forward. Also, the differences in healthy life expectancy at birth versus age 65. So really interesting implications, and also, you know, just the factor that even though we're seeing, you know, generally those graphs on the proportion of life spent in working and retirement over time on average, that actually completely depends on the individual, depending on all the factors you talked about and what implications this might have. So thank you, really interesting. And I'll encourage everyone to keep adding questions to the Q&A. So lots of really interesting questions, but keep adding. We will have time to have quite a good discussion. So I'll now pass on to Stephen Baxter, who's the Head of Innovation and Development at Club Vita. And Stephen has led the design and development of Club Vita's longevity informatic tools from the inception of the club, having developed his skills in the field of liability-driven investing. He has a passion for developing new insights and encyclopedic knowledge of all things longevity related. Stephen's time is primarily spent improving the leading edge longevity solutions and the emerging trends in later life mortality within Vita. Stephen is a prolific contributor to longevity debates within the UK actuarial profession via academic papers, publications, and seminar presentations. So thank you, Stephen. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you for that very kind of flattering introduction. Also, thank you to Matt for that tour de force of the demographic trends impacting the UK. And despite my role being very much involved in innovation and research, I'm going to look less at the actual statistics and numbers in the course of my remarks, and more bring it down to some thoughts and reflections on some of the ramifications. I will anchor my remarks really to this schematic, but I will try and keep those remarks succinct because I know, Sophia, we've got a flood of questions coming in and want to do justice to them. And this schematic really illustrates what I describe as the conventional model, where we think about a period of working and a period of retirement. It's a very simplified model, overly simplified in my view, and certainly not the norm we would expect to see in the future, even if it has been the norm in the past. But the schematic is really helpful to draw out certain features around the interaction of demographics and working lifetimes. And if we move on a slide, I think I will focus my remarks under three broad themes. The first relating to the fact we're living longer and the implications of extending that period of retirement, but also the interaction with the transition to retirement, item 2 on the slide. But I also want to spend some time discussing the impact of changing demographics on working lives, specifically their duration, the nature of our working lives, and what I'll describe as the rhythm of working. So working back from the grave, working back from the end of life, let's think a little bit about increasing life expectancy. As Matt mentioned, our lifetimes on this planet are increasing and are projected to continue to do so. And it's those increases that make us need to reassess the split of working life and later life. But there are some important things to be aware about life expectancy. Whilst it generally continues to increase, and whilst we do predict that each generation born in the UK will live longer than the last, it's not quite as simple as that. If Sophia moves on a slide, we can see that the observed life expectancy has gone up far less over the last decade compared to the decades immediately prior. That can be seen by the shaded bars on this chart, which is showing you the increase in observed life expectancy, in essence, from the start of one decade to the end of it. Believe it or not, there are some darker shaded bars for the 2010s, but they're barely discernible. Essentially, we've had stagnation over this decade, but it's important to realise a lot of that is due to 2020 and the COVID pandemic. The lighter shaded bars strip out the effect of 2020 and show us what was happening up to then in the decade. Some increases, but materially less than the preceding decades. And the fact that life expectancy is going up slower has fed through to a material downrating in the outlook, the official projections of how long generations reaching SPA, state pension age, in the future will ultimately live for. Matt showed us some numbers earlier, if I recollect correctly, the life expectancy for a man, and it included for a man reaching age 68 in 2060. Now that number, and indeed this comparable number for women, has effectively been downrated by around 3.5 years over the last decade. So that element that we think might happen post state pension age is shorter than we previously thought, although it has been going up. But these changes in the outlook for the future do have profound implications for the mechanistic calculation of the state pension age review, which essentially looks at what might need to happen to state pension age in order that our time spent after state pension age is at most 1 year for every 2 spent prior to it. But even if the changing trends in life expectancy were causing enough difficulty in thinking about these dynamics, life expectancy is just an average across society. As individuals, we don't live to that age and drop dead. Some of us enjoy a longer lifetime. Some of us sadly die sooner. And this individual outcome is in part due to partly due to chance, but it's also down to a range of circumstances. And successive Marmot reviews have highlighted the ongoing and indeed widening health inequalities in the UK. And that, of course, manifests through immaterial gaps in longevity and life expectancy and the levelling up white paper that Matt referred to. For me, this comparison on screen is perhaps the most profound way of bringing this to life. It zooms out a little from the map showed us from the Lancet study, which focusing on very small regions. It looks at some slightly broader areas of the UK. And what we're looking at here is for men, and on the lower table for women, the life expectancies as observed towards the start of this millennium and most recently. I've picked out Glasgow primarily because it's one of the areas with the lowest life expectancy at current times. The top right cell in each table. What I find particularly profound here is the gap between that life expectancy and the number I show on the row below. There's a 6-year gap there, but the number for Hart for men and the number for Kensington and Chelsea for women is a number from almost 20 years ago. What we're saying is the areas today with the lowest life expectancy are still falling 6 years short of where some of the best places in the country were 20 years ago. And that really brings, for me, the broader social dynamic through to some of the challenges and differences that exist with longevity and health inequality. And perhaps, therefore, some remarks on the healthy life expectancy. And I agree with Matt, it's a very important measure to look at. It's been increasing, slower than life expectancy. And a general rule of thumb is for it at the moment, it's around about every year of extra life expectancy. It's probably equating to something like 7 to 8 months in good health. But of course, the fact it's not 1 for 1 means the period where we have care needs is extending. And the nature of those care needs is also changing. 40 years ago, the top killer of our over 60-year-olds was heart disease. A combination of lifestyle changes, medical advancements, and others mean that deaths from heart disease have fallen. Cancer incidence has risen, but fortunately, cancer deaths largely not so, although it is now a leading killer for men. And mental nervous diseases like dementia are very much rising and leading the causes of death for older ages. And as a society, we're growing, not just in numbers, but also in BMI. With rising obesity, we run a hidden risk of increased morbidity from heart disease and diabetes amongst 50 to 60-year-olds of the future. So all of these changing health dynamics have an implication in terms of the costs, in terms of treatment and care, but also changing needs. And that adds to the fiscal challenges of the changing demographics. But returning to the schematic that we've got on screen, I'd like to think a little bit about the retirement cliff edge. And indeed, this schematic kind of risks conveying with the purple dot that there is a cliff edge there. In practice, changing demographics will influence and change that transition between working and retirement. And I think it will move us away from a cliff edge, at least at a societal level. And if we move on a slide, the earlier graphic that Matt showed us illustrated this, effectively highlighting there's a 15-year window running, broadly speaking, from 10 years before state pension age to 5 years after, during which people transition out of full employment. And this also gives us some clues to the later life dynamics happening at the individual level. Transition will be determined by an individual's ability to work, ability to retire, and their expectations based upon a lifetime of hearing about state pension age. And in this regard, the transition for some individuals certainly remains a cliff edge, as it's that personal reality about the ability to work and ability to retire, which is ultimately driven by health and affordability. Health determines both our ability to enjoy retirement, but also crucially determines our ability to remain in many types of employment. Affordability, or rather the security of income, determines the ability to exit the workforce should you so desire. Security of income in turn is driven by availability. When can I draw my pension? And where the state pension is a meaningful part of overall income, this will often anchor expectations. There's the level of income. How much can I draw? With a generation of people with DC pension pots increasingly reaching retirement, it's likely that they'll need to wait longer to have sufficient income to top up the state pension to what they consider to be an acceptable level of income. And realism also needs to factor in here around how long we will live for. As individuals, we tend to systematically underestimate our life expectancy, and this clearly compounds the challenges facing the DC generation in timing their retirement. So I think it's inevitable that many will need to wait for the state pension to be able to afford to retire, unless their health or other circumstances entitle them to alternative support, in essence, a substitute form of benefit income. And it's this substitution effect which I believe is at the heart of some of the fiscal challenges of increasing state pension age. In essence, we can't increase state pension age and see the fiscal balance sheet change if we're not considering what will happen to the folk who may not be healthy enough to remain in the workplace. And this is one of the many reasons why I believe we need to be focusing much more on the measures of healthy life expectancy, the narrowing of the gap, and indeed the increasing of healthy life expectancy as per the Levelling Up paper. But if we move on a slide, I'd like to reflect briefly on the primary question of how will working lifetimes change. And I was struck by, within that question, three key themes: the duration of our working lifetime, the nature of working life, and the rhythm. We spoke quite a bit about duration. The duration of retirement has increased by far more than the duration of working lifetimes, and its balance will need to change. But the nature of working lifetime, I believe, will also need to change. Automation and technology have made today's workplace largely unrecognisable in many industries to what it was a couple of decades ago. And for many sectors, COVID has accelerated change, both in some places for positive, and indeed in some places potentially for negative. And the skills required in many workplaces have shifted and will continue to shift as well. The availability, as well as the nature of work, is also key, clearly. And that has the fiscal dimension of economic prosperity and the number of available jobs. But whatever the job market looks like, it's very likely to require different skills over time. And that will have a call on the availability of those skills in the marketplace, in the labour force. And that brings into play consideration of the digitisation, technology development, and the potential or upskilling of our labour market. Indeed, futurologists, those who specialise in the ramifications of change for future decades, would already point out that the 9-to-5, 5-day-a-week working concept is an antiquated one. We only have to look out to Iceland to see the trials there for a 4-day working week in the public sector, the same pay for shorter hours. And similar trials are now being run in other countries and have expanded out to the private sector. Now, the Icelandic trial found that the productivity remained the same despite the reduced hours, and indeed in some cases improved. And of course, workplace and workforce satisfaction materially improved. One of the areas of success being in the improved work-life split, enabling not just more time for leisure, but also for important activities like caring. And this leads me on to the rhythm of work. And if we move on a slide to my final schematic, this illustrates just one possible lifetime for future generations. I see it as far more a rhythm of education, work and breaks, with retirement crucially not being the only break in that lifetime. Within this illustration, I see the potential for reduced hours across the labour market, but for more years. I certainly see a need for accessible reskilling opportunities during our careers. And I see family dynamics impacting how we want to structure working lives, with increased flexing of hours, breaks from the labour market, by both parents during the child rearing and nurturing years, but also workplaces needing to adapt to the changing needs of their employees. For example, for those having caring needs to enable them to remain partially at work or have periods of absence. And to promote the health and well-being of their staff, including accommodating the changes to health that inevitably happen to us as we move through the life course. And in this regard, I see the corporate social responsibility and the environmental and social governance agenda being key that it starts to also look at health. There are also needs for change in the labour market. Us as individuals need to adapt to this new rhythm. And this might include more acceptance of the gig economy, a realisation that we need to go back to school during our careers, and certainly greater preparation for the later stages, an awareness of saving and a realisation of how long we may live for, and therefore how we may transition to retirement. A beacon of hope is that in many sectors, the workplace is already, I believe, entering a more enlightened period. It's provided flexibilities like those shown in this rhythm already. And it's often led by a generation of management that perhaps themselves have experienced some of the challenges of demographic changes bringing us, as though more empathetic. But these attitudes and opportunities don't necessarily pervade throughout our economy, and I hope they will spread to more sectors over time. But we also crucially need to be supported by some changes to address some of the structural challenges, including the health inequalities that impede this vision. So if I were to sum up a quick couple of remarks on screen, we are living longer and in part healthier lives. The age structure of our population is changing, and the notion of a working lifetime followed by retirement may, indeed perhaps, needs to become far more of an education work break rhythm. But this also needs to be, and I hope will be, supported by opportunities to reskill and diminishing health inequalities, with which I hope Sophia opens up a few thought-provoking remarks for our audience to challenge and question us on.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Stephen. What an interesting discussion. Some really interesting points there. I think really delve deeper into those points about health and inequalities, and actually fascinating. You know, we really need to focus on this more and the measures going forward. That's will have implications for lots of really interesting debates. For one, you know, the state pension age review, and really interesting point about the potential for reduced hours, but working for more years. I think this is a really topical point. We're seeing that with discussions about the 4-day week. So yeah, really interesting points around that area. Great. So as mentioned, just keep adding questions to the Q&A, and I'll start kind of the discussion now. But do keep adding, everybody. So we've got lots of questions already. So maybe one quick question to start might be just kind of wondering what the trends, you know, we've seen that people have been working more flexibly since COVID. What are we actually seeing in the data going forward? Are there differences in who's working flexibly, you know, by gender, by age? Are we seeing, what kind of trends are we seeing? It'd just be interesting to add to that. That could be for Matt and Stephen.
Shall I come in first and then Stephen can add? So I think the challenge at the moment is it's early days, so I think there's not huge amounts of data available on this. But what we are clearly seeing is there are, and what COVID has exposed is even further those variations across the population. So there are different jobs that provide different flexibilities, and that to some extent aligns as well with the chart I showed earlier of the whole country and the disparities you see between life expectancy across the country, with different areas of the country having more or less of certain industries. I think that is a feature that again has to be addressed. So that's part of the levelling up discussion and addressing that. What we are definitely seeing in recent years, though, is a move for what used to be predominantly a female focused part-time working. That is now more common for males to be working part-time as well, and the balance between males and females working part-time and more flexibly is evening out, whereas it used to be very, very diverse between the two groups. And hopefully that means there's a wider sort of consolidation and equality between all groups that have more access. But I think there are still issues, as I said, between different industries and what that means around geographical locations as well.
Thank you, Matt. It's really interesting about the differences between males and females, changing patterns for males. Stephen, I just wondered if you had any thoughts to add.
I think I'd echo what Matt said. I think it's too early to see the emerging data from COVID and to see how much of that is the patterns that we've seen in recent times, how much that will persist post-pandemic. But if we look over a slightly longer time frame, and I'm basing a lot of my remarks on anecdotal evidence, I'm certainly seeing that individuals are seeing more flexibilities, enjoying more flexibilities. And actually, this is, whilst it perhaps was the preserve for certain sectors in the past, I think it's moving more and more out. As Matt says, some jobs I'll find easier to provide flexibilities on where you work. Obviously some jobs require you to be in a specific location, but the flexibilities around the hours you work, part-time, full-time, certainly that I've seen expand a lot.
Yeah, it's really interesting, these inequalities. And just another question from the audience, which is kind of picking up on your presentation, Stephen. What impact might more flexible working habits of the movement towards 4-day working week have on healthy life expectancy? And I think you mentioned it is likely to be positive, but just wondering, there are some people that have said, since COVID, actually working from home has actually led more people to work longer hours and maybe burnout. So I'm just wondering if there's a two-sided, or is generally really positive. Will everyone be able to benefit from this, and how can we push them more towards that if that's where we should be going?
So instinctively, I would say that if we move to a 4-day week and with that commensurate reduction in hours, that it should improve healthy life expectancy. Some of the stresses around the work-life balance obviously would be alleviated, and particularly if that shift is also includes a flexibility on working the hours to when you're most productive and what works best for you. That certainly also improves even such basic things as sleep rhythms, which influence our health. I think ultimately at a sort of macro level, whilst it would be a positive driver, we do have to bear in mind that actually what really influences our health and healthy life expectancy is the decisions, the choices, the behaviours that we make as individuals. It's just because you're working a 4-day week or 5-day week that might enable some healthier life choices and decisions, but it isn't the panacea per se. It's part of a bigger picture.
Thank you. Don't know, Matt, if you have anything to add. No worries if not.
The only thing I'd add on that relates to the work from home element of those flexibilities, and I know that's grown tremendously as a result of COVID. But I think what we have seen, which kind of relates to your point about working longer hours and the burnout that could create, that there is there is some evidence of increased stress and increased mental health challenges from a shift to working from home in some cases. So I think there's questions about what do we mean by health and what aspects of health are we thinking of here, and ultimately I think it all comes down to how much flexibility there is and how easy it is for people to find the right balance of what works best for them. We could talk about flexibilities that actually aren't flexibilities if they start to be imposed by certain organisations, and then people have to again operate in a certain way which doesn't suit them. So I think there's lots of questions about it, and we're very early in really understanding what the outcome from those will be.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I was just wondering, I think both of your presentations you mentioned about that proportion of working life and retirement actually spent in retirement. And I think Stephen was saying that we've actually seen, at least until recently, a growth in the proportion of life spent in retirement. And I was just wondering your thoughts on how does this differ for different groups? Do we know, how this differs for people living in deprived areas, people in poor health? Yeah, just wondering on your thoughts on the implications.
I'll jump in to start with the IFS survey that I referenced did have a little look at some of this, and it did indicate that those in more deprived areas are more likely to work longer, work to any increased state pension age. Now that may well be for financial reasons, more difficulty in moving to retirement because they have lower wealth and need to continue working. But I think there's, again, it's never that clear cut, is it? So what also tends to happen is there are more people who don't have the health to carry on working for as long in some of the more deprived areas because of the type of work that they're involved in that's more physically demanding, which again goes back to the need to address the disparities between different areas and level up across the board and try and address some of those challenges for different groups.
Great. And Stephen, did you have anything to add?
Just to remark that, or echo what Matt was saying there, that a number of parts of the UK, the life expectancy of birth falls short still of SPA, state pension age, and that naturally translates to, if you do even the mechanistic calculation, to a very small proportion of what's deemed to be adult life over age 20 being spent, or anticipated to be spent post state pension age. And this, for me, really is the challenge we have. There's been a lot of good debate around the universal state pension age and pushing that out, but of course the inevitable consequence of you pushing that out without narrowing those health inequalities is the group, as it were, that gets left behind, that's caught in that trap between being healthy enough to remain in the working and yet not able yet to get state pension. And as a society, we will hold a duty to those individuals, a duty of care to those individuals, and that ultimately means it's a bit of a just increasing state pension age is a bit of a fiscal red herring, in the sense you're not going to get the balance sheet savings in the economy of the nation without addressing that gap in that healthy life expectancy, that gap in healthiness that happens in people's 50s and 60s. That's very different across the country, and which is why I'm so passionate about the healthy life expectancy debate, because I see it as not only helping us in terms of managing some of our state benefit provision, but also as well things like the overarching costs of prevention and treatment in the NHS.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I was just wondering how these trends, kind of the demographic trends, particularly trend toward flexibility, what this actually means for our ability to plan for later life, and in particular save for retirement. A question from the audience.
It's a good question. Saving for retirement, obviously auto enrolment has come in and brought a whole lot of people into retirement savings for the first time, and actually the shift to more DC pension provision possibly fits better with the type of scenario that Stephen was talking about, with a kind of a fluctuating working life that has periods in and out of work or moving between different things. That possibly fits better with DC, but obviously the challenge there is ensuring that there is sufficient saving of that nature happening, so that there's still sufficient funds when you reach retirement. And the challenge around that as well is, well, what can you secure when you reach a reasonable retirement age, and how do you secure that that income for the rest of your life? Now, I think, as Stephen alluded to, the more flexibilities you build in, potentially the more, or the less you have available to save during that working life, which would naturally mean you need to continue saving for longer before you've got sufficient to say, I can just rely on savings to support myself. So it's kind of I don't think there's nothing that stops that happening, but it's a kind of an integrated system where you have to balance off how early would you want to retire versus how much flexibility do you want during your working life.
No, I would concur. For me, it's about sufficiency, the sufficiency of funds, and having for your later life planning, the realism of how long you may live for, and the realism about what your health prospects are going to be like and potential care needs. And the other buzzword I'd put in is phasing, the fact that it's not that cliff edge. I think actually when you're starting to think about planning for later life, it may well be planning with recognition that you may wish to look at maybe reducing the number of hours in current employment, or indeed alternative employments that offer that flexibilities around the number of hours, so you can phase in, so that actually when so that you have a mix of income sources as we go into later life, because the savings pots and the retirement savings pots are unlikely to be sufficient in isolation as things currently stand.
That's really interesting. And actually, just kind of on that point, I think ILC previously did some research and actually showed that, kind of as you're saying, both of you, that we are spending a greater proportion of life in retirement, and actually, we could potentially work flexibly and a lot longer. And a little bit longer, but have much more flexible lives and still work the same amount. So, like you were saying, maybe there is a potential to still save, but, will those that are the well-off simply retire earlier, and we won't be able to actually make that up, in terms of sufficient retirement savings? That's a really interesting point. And just some from the audience, we're seeing a lot of points around, whether older workers will be able to get up to scratch with kind of new technologies. How can we support that? And the difficulties, and also for unpaid carers, how will that have the impact on the way we work and kind of flexible working lives? So I know, Stephen, you touched upon those points, so I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, maybe I'll just give a couple of remarks. So I think there's a theme around older individuals, and I guess digitalization, getting up to scratch with new technology. I think this is a combination of factors. There's something around, I would describe as accessible reskilling opportunities, accessible opportunities to enable people to become familiar with technology over the life course, and things adapting in the world around them. But it's also an appreciation of different skill sets. We don't all have to be digitally native. We don't all have to be able to program or work with the most sophisticated technology. And indeed, if we think about the society and consumers as a whole, there's a range of skills out there, and actually individuals who are less up to scratch, as it were, technological thinking do have a huge amount to add in, even things like the user experience and how accessible is this, how much of the consumer market are you alienating. And alongside that, I think there's a very important concept which I'll probably allude to as a digital concierge, for want of a better phrase. But it's actually companies beginning to appreciate that when they're producing very technologically sophisticated products, or the workplace is getting more technologically sophisticated, that actually you do need to help people get up to speed. And the personal example I would give was actually trying to help an older relative with an iPhone, purchasing a new iPhone recently. They've managed to do very well. They're now quite adept users. They can use the sat nav on it when they're in the car, really hands-free. And they send me daily their Wordle score. They've done that, and they can send me a WhatsApp message. They've become, as it were, digitally native in that bit of technology. But the important but is it required patience. And it required an accessible user manual, which in that instance was myself, rather than you have to access the internet to find out how you access the internet in order to set up your device. That kind of paradigm is not something for the future. And that's why I talk about the thing of the digital concierge. Some of the more forward-thinking companies I've seen have actually build in that kind of talking you through the steps to give you the confidence, and realizing for somebody who, whatever is digital or otherwise, where an experience is new, does need their hand held, they need to be upskilled, they need to learn and be educated. And that's where I think we are going to face challenges in the future if we're going to actually see that sort of that rhythm I described, because those of us who are digitally native now almost certainly won't be digital natives in 20 or 30 years' time, with things have moved on in the world around us.
That's really interesting. And actually, some people won't have that support, like, you know, someone like yourself to be patient. So it's interesting that some people will and some people won't. And yeah, that's really interesting. Just in the interest of time, I'll move on to kind of closing remarks. So just, you know, I haven't unfortunately been able to answer every question. So if there are any other questions you'd like to pick up, or just general remarks. And I guess, Stephen, you know, from your presentation, it does seem that you seem quite for the idea of moving towards flexible, slightly longer working lives. You know, how can the government support that, or kind of, you know, other key stakeholders? So yeah, just closing remarks from both of you.
Shall I go first then? So I think what I've taken away from this, and looking at all the questions and Stephen's useful presentation, is really a reflection that things are changing. You know, we are moving into a world in which work looks different. The ways of working are changing. Our life expectancies are changing, and that is just one element of the piece. And none of these things can be considered in isolation. So we touched briefly on, you know, saving for retirement and ensuring that people have sufficient funds to be able to retire when they want to. I think a big challenge there, which links through all of this, is one, understanding how much you need to retire and when you retire and how you retire, but also how you build up that fund to get to retirement, and that requires an understanding of, you know, health care costs, you know, how investments might perform, you know, how much you can earn at different stages of your life, what the opportunities are, and what the flexibilities are, and those are all changing. So it very much in line with what Stephen was just saying about, you know, supporting people through digitization and a changing technological world. There is something about supporting people through really understanding their life options and what they need to do to put themselves in the best position for later life.
Thank you, Matt and Stephen.
Thank you. That's a couple of concluding thoughts. I think it is inevitable that working lifetimes will span more chronological years, but doesn't necessarily mean we're going to work more in total. I think we will see the reduced hours and the flexibilities described. However, as you rightly say, what are the sort of the policy and the impetuses we need to do that? But if I was to sum it up in one word, it'd be recognition, and it'd be recognition of two things. That actually there's a really important later life skills development and that's needed. I've seen in the chat a number of people commenting on the recognition of the skills older workers already bring to the labour market, but also making accessible reskilling and upskilling during career for anyone who wishes to fail themselves is really important. And that is probably going to require a degree of subsidy to support for the societal benefit. And I also think, as it's come up a number of times in the conversation, let's give the recognition to the carer aspect. The flexibilities that the informal care sector needs are significant, but it also needs to have recognition. It needs to recognise that it's not economically periods of economic inactivity. Quite the contrary, you're providing so very valuable to society and indirectly to the economy, and therefore that should be recognised in terms of appropriate crediting in towards pensions and been thinking about what it might mean in terms of encouraging employers for continuity of pensions provision during that time where possible. Which brings me back really to that corporate world also having a very important role to play in this, and that pillar of health within the environmental and social governance agenda.
Thank you. And I think, we're very much in agreement. And I think ILC, we've done some work on unpaid contributions. We're looking to do some work on lifelong learning. So really fascinating points there. And yeah, thank you both for really fascinating presentations. So I'll just kind of draw to a close now. So thank you to everyone who attended today. Thank you to our speakers, to the Government Actual Department and our partners, and to Steve. So ILC's next webinar will be the launch of Generation Facts, a major new piece of novel research where we have tested the potential of using social media to engage different generations in promoting vaccination uptake, which will take place at 1 p.m. on Tuesday, the 15th of March. Speakers at the event include Professor Andrew Pollard, who's the chair of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, Dr. Catherine Duggan, who's the CEO of the International Pharmaceutical Federation, and the many more speakers I hope I can go through. We've also got Ayesha Kasali, who's Strategic Programs Partnerships of Health at Meta. So lots of different speakers at different angles there. So we really hope you can join us. And for news on ILC's latest webinars and to stay up to date with all ILC news, please visit ILC's website at ilcuk.org.uk, join our mailing list and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at ILC UK, and subscribe to ILC's YouTube channel for all the newest, latest webinars and videos. So we really hope to welcome you at another webinar event in the near future. So thank you everyone, a really fascinating discussion, some really interesting points about that kind of flexible working lives and working for longer but more flexibly. I think that's the direction we're going, and I hope to pick up that point in future kind of work and events. Thank you everyone. Thank you all for attending.